The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a swarm of insects trapped in plastic. Katie Rodriguez pushed through the Cedar Creek Medical Emergency Department doors at 6:06 a.m. on her first Monday, the September cold still clinging to her scrubs. Nobody noticed her. That was the entire point. She moved through the halls with the kind of invisibility that only came from practice, head down, clipboard clutched, competent but unremarkable. The antiseptic smell hit first, then the deeper notes, stale coffee from the break room 3 corridors away, something faintly metallic underneath it all. Blood. Old, cleaned, but still there if you knew how to breathe. The ER was already chaos. A drunk driver from the night shift, still cuffed to a gurney in Bay 3. A diabetic in DKA gasping shallow breaths. An elderly woman who'd fallen in her kitchen, complaining about her shoulder while the nurses knew it was worse. Katie had seen worse. She'd held worse. She'd saved worse while rounds of gunfire punched through plywood walls in a combat support hospital 6,800 miles from here. But nobody at Cedar Creek knew that. Nobody needed to know that Katie Rodriguez, RN, had spent 7 years as a Marine captain running medical operations in places the evening news barely mentioned. Her security clearance was classified so high that even the hospital's background check had hit a wall she'd designed. The Pentagon had placed her here for weeks ago with a simple mission: investigate, monitor, document. The billing patterns connected to military veteran admissions at Cedar Creek had tripped the Defense Department's fraud algorithms, and something about those patterns smelled wrong. Someone inside this hospital was getting rich off soldiers. Katie's hands, marked with 3 small surgical scars and the kind of calluses that came from handling equipment in extreme conditions, moved through her first patient intake with mechanical precision. Vitals. Chart review. Patient history. She caught things other nurses missed because she'd been trained to catch things: a slight pause in the elderly patient's breathing that suggested aspiration risk, a tremor in a younger man's hands that wasn't alcohol withdrawal but early infection response. She noted everything. Her charting was meticulous. Obsessive. The kind of detailed documentation that left no room for questions or discrepancies. Exactly as intended. Dr. Marcus Pierce swept through the ER at 7:34 a.m. like someone had told him the oxygen in the room would bow. Chief of Surgery, 58, Rolex that probably cost more than Katie's annual salary, the kind of jaw that benefited from good lighting and better angles. He wore his position like cologne, invisible but pervasive, making everyone in his vicinity adjust their posture. The nurses straightened. The residents stepped back. Even the cleaning staff seemed to move faster when he passed. Katie continued charting. She'd learned early that notice was dangerous. "Get me the admission logs for the past 60 days, Pierce said to nobody in particular. A resident scrambled. "Veteran admission specifically. I want to see billing codes." Katie's pen didn't pause. Her pulse didn't spike. She'd been trained by people who could take sniper fire without flinching. A doctor's casual demand for records wasn't going to rattle her. But something in the way he'd asked, the specificity, the urgency, told her he'd noticed the audit trail forming. He knew something was wrong. He just didn't know what. Or who. The morning progressed in the rhythm of any emergency department. Traumas and fevers, medication questions, and discharge instructions. Katie worked through her assigned section with the kind of quiet efficiency that made her invisible to the hierarchy. The experienced nurses barely acknowledged her. The residents hadn't learned her name. The attendings simply assumed she was competent enough not to need supervision. All of it was perfect cover. Around 10:22 a.m., a new admission rolled through the doors. Elderly Marine. General rank still carrying in the way his shoulders sat despite obvious pain. The paramedic report was brief: cardiac workup needed, possible angina, stable for now. Katie was assigned to room for 47. She recognized him the moment she entered. 18 years older than the last time she'd seen him, gray at the temples instead of black, but the same steady eyes. Same precise way of moving despite the obvious discomfort. This was General Thomas Halloway. In Tikrit, he'd been Staff Sergeant Halloway, the battalion medic who'd taken over her shift rotation when she'd rotated stateside. He'd been good. Better than good. She'd trained him personally on their last 2 weeks of overlap, drilling him on every contingency she could think of. 6 months after she left theater, he'd caught shrapnel clearing a building. Saved 3 junior Marines' lives that day. Nearly died doing it. She'd gotten the casualty report through official channels and nothing else, just a name, a date, a status change. MEDEVAC to Germany. Then stateside. Then silence. He didn't recognize her. Why would he? She'd been Captain Rodriguez then. Now she was just Katie, RN, crisp scrubs and a name badge. Her dark hair was shorter. She'd put on exactly the right amount of civilian weight. Her call sign, Nightingale 6, was locked away where it belonged. "Good morning, General," she said, keeping her voice in the careful register she perfected. Deferential. Quiet. The voice of someone who'd learned not to be noticed. "I'm going to get your vitals and run an EKG. You're in good hands." His eyes tracked her movements. Not recognition. Just the kind of awareness a career Marine maintained even lying in a hospital bed. She moved with practiced efficiency, inserting the leads, watching the monitor spike and settle. His heart rhythm was strong. Whatever brought him here, it wasn't imminent cardiac failure. "You've got the steadiest hands I've seen in years," he said. Katie continued her work. "Thank you, sir." "Where'd you train?" She hesitated for exactly half a second. "Naval Hospital San Diego. Trauma rotation. It shows." She finished the EKG without answering. The strip printed out in clean black lines, the kind of easy readability that meant nothing was wrong in his electrics. She documented everything with the same obsessive precision that had started attracting Dr. Pierce's attention. Every note. Every observation. Every small detail that mattered. When she stepped out of the room, Dr. Pierce was waiting in the corridor near the medication dispensary. He was reviewing something on his tablet. He didn't look up. "The new girl," he said. A statement, not a question. "Captain," Katie corrected quietly. The word escaped before she could stop it. Marine instinct. "You corrected rank." He looked at her then. "Excuse me." "Yes, sir." "First month on the unit. Is there something you need?" "Your charting is excessive," he said. His voice carried the particular confidence of someone who'd never been contradicted successfully. "For paragraphs on a patient with stable vitals? That's not nursing. That's documentation bloat. We keep things streamlined here." She didn't respond. Streamlined meant fewer questions. Fewer questions meant easier fraud. "Adjust your approach," Pierce said, turning back to his tablet. "Less detail. More efficiency. You're creating work for administration." "Understood, sir," Katie said. She walked back to the nurse's station and continued her charting exactly as before. Every detail. Every observation. The audit trail forming one careful line at a time. What she didn't know was that room 447's resident had already flagged for something else. Routine background check on the general's admission. Routine verification of his insurance. Routine query into his military record. And when that query hit the Pentagon systems, something had sparked. The query into General Halloway's military record sparked something at the Pentagon, but Katie didn't know that yet. What she knew was the silence in the break room when she sat down with her tray at 11:02 a.m. on her 3rd week. She'd chosen a seat at the far end of the table, back to the wall, the way her training had taught her. Old habits. The nursing station had been too exposed, Dr. Pierce making rounds, his voice carrying that particular edge when he addressed the residents. Katie had excused herself quietly, professionally, the way a first-month nurse should when the attending surgeon was in teaching mode. The break room had been full. 18 staff members spread across 3 tables, the kind of crowded that meant real conversation, actual laughter. The kind of crowded that meant safety in numbers. She Saturday opened her salad. The fork made a small sound against the plastic container. Within 90 seconds, they left. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious. 2 residents stood first, citing a discharge summary. The ICU nurse grabbed her coffee and drifted toward the hallway. A phlebotomist mentioned something about labs running. By the 2-minute mark, the table where Katie sat held only her, an abandoned yogurt cup, and the fluorescent light buzzing overhead like something dying. She kept eating. That was the training talking. Keep moving. Don't acknowledge. Don't react. The moment you show it bothers you, the predator circles tighter. Katie had learned that in Anbar Province. She was learning it again in Colorado Springs, only this time the weapons were social exclusion and a surgical attending's institutional power. Her jaw tightened. Just slightly. A small muscle contraction near her left temple that no one was around to see anyway. The next day, morning rounds arrived at 6:13 a.m. with Dr. Pierce moving through Cedar Creek's post-op wing like a man auditing a company that had disappointed him. 14 patients. 3 residents trailing behind him. Katie finishing her vital sign checks on the general, blood pressure stable, oxygen saturation holding at 94%, clear bilateral breath sounds. She'd trained him on this exact assessment in a field hospital 23 kilometers north of Fallujah, 8 years ago. General Holloway had been a Marine then too, a staff sergeant with the kind of focus that made him dangerous and brilliant. She'd shown him how to listen for breath sounds, how to feel for air movement, how to recognize when something inside a human body had shifted wrong. He'd caught shrapnel 3 weeks after she rotated stateside. He'd caught it doing her job. Captain Rodriguez, Dr. Pierce said. Not her name. Her rank, stretched out like an accusation. The residents turned. The break room ostracism had been subtle enough to write off as coincidence. This was different. This was public. Katie looked up from the general's chart, meeting Pierce's eyes. Neutral expression. Ready. I received a report, Pierce continued, stepping into the room with the authority of a man who'd never been questioned in his life, about a medication administration error yesterday at 19:30 hours. Vancomycin ordered for Mr. Chen in for 47, wasn't it? No error, Katie said. Her voice came out flat. Professional. Patient received correct dose, correct route, correct time. Chart confirms administration. And yet, Pierce said, his voice dropping into that particular register that made residents lean in, the patient's family reported some concern about the foresight. The lie was so precise it was almost beautiful. Mr. Chen's for was fine. Katie had personally assessed it 4 times after administration, documentation in the chart in handwriting no one in Cedar Creek knew belonged to a Marine who'd read vitals in a combat zone. But the general was listening now. Katie could feel his attention shift. I reviewed the site, she said. Still level. Still stoic. No signs of infiltration, phlebitis, or erythema. Patient pain level 0. Full range of motion in hand. Pierce smiled. The kind of smile that came before the knife went in. Your first month here, nurse, and you've shown some gaps in your clinical judgment. I'm documenting this. He turned to the residents. This is an example of how charting can mask poor patient care. Notice how thorough it appears? That's the danger of assuming documentation equals competence. He was watching her. Waiting for her to break. Waiting for her voice to waver or her hands to shake or for her eyes to water the way people's eyes did when they were being dismantled in front of an audience. Katie's hands remained steady on the general's chart. Her breathing unchanged. She'd been briefed on Dr. Pierce's background before the assignment, legacy name, father was a cardiac surgeon, grandfather was chief of surgery at Johns Hopkins 32 years ago. He'd inherited competence and entitlement in equal measure, and somewhere along the way, the entitlement had calcified into something that needed an enemy to justify itself. "Understood, Dr. Pierce," she said. "Do you?" He stepped closer. "Because what I'm seeing is someone who charted a perfect assessment, and yet a family had concerns. That kind of disconnect between documentation and reality suggests either dishonesty or incompetence." "Which is it?" The general shifted slightly in his bed. Katie could feel his pulse rising under her fingertips where her hand still rested on his wrist, taking his count. 88 beats per minute. Elevated. Angry. Neither, Katie said. The patient had no complications. "For now," Pierce said. And turned to leave, his white coat moving like something predatory. The residents followed, and as they did, the attending looked back at Katie with the kind of satisfied expression that came from successfully planting doubt in 4 sets of young ears. The morning rounds took 43 minutes. The noon shift started at 11 o'clock. By 2:38 p.m., Katie's personnel file had a written notation on the unit board in Dr. Pierce's handwriting, clipped to the bulletin where all the nursing staff reviews were posted, visible to anyone walking past. Medication administration discrepancy. Insufficient clinical assessment. Recommended for remedial training. The notation had been signed by the Gold Star family's name. Mrs. Chen. Except Mrs. Chen had never complained. Katie had reviewed the chart 3 times to be certain. The husband had thanked her this morning. The daughter had asked her how long she'd been nursing. This was different from the break room silence. This was strategic. This was a man building a case. The shift ended at 7 p.m. Katie finished her charting, reviewed the general's evening labs, ensured the night nurse had everything needed. She moved through the hospital corridors the way a woman moves through a space where she no longer quite belongs, focused, efficient, unremarkable. Just a nurse trying to do her job. The supply closet at the end of the 3rd floor hallway was storage for 4 kits, dressing changes, and empty boxes. It had a lock. Katie locked herself inside at 19:53 and stood in the dark for 2 minutes without moving. Then she reached under her scrubs, found the inner pocket of the jacket hung on the back of her door at the employee locker, fingers seeking the faded unit patch sewn into the lining. 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. 8 years of her life in a rectangle of faded cotton, stitched into the lining so carefully that no one else would ever see it unless they knew exactly where to look. Her fingers pressed against it. Across the worn embroidery. The stitching was coming loose near the corner where she'd touched it 1,000 times before, on deployment, in flight, in moments that felt impossible. She pressed her palm flat against it and allowed herself to feel something other than composure. Just for 2 minutes. Just in the dark. The pension that Dr. Pierce didn't know existed. The security clearance that was, at that exact moment, being cross-referenced against Cedar Creek Medical's newly initiated background check on all nursing staff. The paperwork that had been sitting in the Pentagon system for 8 years, waiting for a routine query on an old patient's military record, a patient named Holloway who had served under a woman whose name, when entered into the Department of Defense database, would trigger more than a dozen classified flags. Katie pressed her fingers against the patch and breathed through her nose, and somewhere in a building in Arlington, Virginia, a server processed a database query that would change the next 72 hours. She released the patch. Stood in the supply closet for 1 more second. Then emerged, locked the door, and walked back onto the ward where Dr. Pierce was waiting. He was building a case to destroy her credibility. He didn't know she was building one against him, and that hers had federal backing. The general's monitor began singing a different song at 2:38 p.m. Katie was in room for 47, checking the chest tube that had been placed after surgery 6 hours earlier, when the rhythm fractured. Not a dramatic flat line, something worse. The beeping accelerated into a frantic staccato, and the oxygen saturation numbers started their descent like a stone through dark water. 88, 84. 79. His lung, she said. Not a question. The visualization was already forming in her mind, muscle memory older than her nursing credential. Tension pneumothorax. air accumulating in the pleural space, collapsing the lung, compressing the heart. The kind of cascade that killed you in minutes if you didn't move. The on-call resident, Dr. Morrison, stood frozen at the foot of the bed. 28 years old, 6 months into his first surgical rotation, and his hands had gone completely still. His eyes tracked the monitor like it was speaking a language he'd never learned. Katie watched his shoulders rise and fall twice, 3 times, searching for a protocol that wasn't coming. Dr. Morrison. Her voice dropped an octave. Not a question. Not even quite a request. We need to decompress. Now. He turned to her. The look on his face was the look of someone drowning in shallow water. The attending is in the OR. Should we call? The saturation hit 71. The general's lips were already turning the color of storm clouds. Katie was moving before the thought finished forming. The supply tray was 3 steps away. Her hands knew this distance. Her hands remembered Tikrit, the 2013 deployment, forward operating base Shank in Logar province, the dusty aid station with the rattle of small arms fire in the distance and Staff Sergeant Halloway learning to keep people alive with what you had instead of what you needed. She'd trained him in this exact procedure. She'd watched his hand shake the first time, then steady, then move like someone who understood that hesitation was a luxury measured in heartbeats. The irony wasn't lost on her. He was the one on the stretcher now. Katie's gloved fingers found the 14-gauge angiocath needle before her mind fully caught up with her body. The sterile prep pad was already in her other hand, the kind of simultaneous motion that looked like magic to people who hadn't spent 1,000 hours in field medicine. She swabbed the skin over the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomical landmark burned into her nervous system like a scar. Stay with him, she told Morrison, moving to the general's side. Push epi if his pressure drops below 60. The needle went in at the angle her shoulders remembered. Not perpendicular to the skin, angled slightly toward the ribs, avoiding the neurovascular bundle that ran along the inferior surface. The resistance changed as she pierced the pleura, and then the hiss of air escaping. It was the sound of pressure releasing, of physics correcting itself. That sound meant something. That sound meant seconds of life returning to the equation. The lung was re-expanding, the heart had room to beat again, and Katie was already removing the catheter while leaving the plastic cannula in place, a one-way valve against catastrophe. She didn't check the monitor. She didn't need to. The numbers were already climbing. 75, 82, 88, 92. Stable. The room had gone completely quiet. Even the ventilator seemed to hold its breath, and she could hear the fluorescent lights above them emitting that soft, almost apologetic hum of electricity finding its path through superheated gas. Dr. Morrison was staring at her. Actually staring. His mouth was slightly open, like he'd just watched someone pull a rabbit from the empty air. The general's eyes fluttered, not awake, but present. Responding to the chemical signals his body was sending about oxygenation and survival. That was. Morrison started, then stopped. How did you, where did you learn? Triage protocol, Katie said, finishing the task. Her hands were already moving to secure the catheter with tape, each movement economical and precise. When you don't have another option, you become the option. She said it without looking at him. Without emphasis. Just the way someone talks about weather when they're focused on keeping a human being from dying. But the words hung in the air like they meant something more, and Morrison, green as he was, seemed to feel it. His eyes narrowed slightly, like he was trying to solve an equation and one of the variables had just shifted. That was when Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway. He'd been standing there long enough to see the entire sequence. Katie registered him in her peripheral vision the way soldiers register threats, not looking directly, but knowing exactly where he stood, how far away, whether he was a problem. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, his face utterly neutral in a way that felt more dangerous than anger. His hand was still on the door frame, and his gaze moved from Katie to the general to Morrison and back to Katie again, like he was cataloguing information, filing it away. The general's stable, Katie said, Her voice level. Tension pneumothorax. Needle decompression at 2:38 p.m. 30 seconds from decompensation when we intervened. Pierce didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched out long enough for Morrison to shift his weight. Long enough for the monitors to establish their new rhythm. Long enough for Katie to understand that something had just shifted in the equation that had nothing to do with the general's oxygen saturation. "I see," Pierce finally said. His voice was perfectly calm. The voice of someone thinking several moves ahead. "Very efficient work, Rodriguez. Very skilled." He was still looking at her. Not with anger. With something that looked almost like recognition, and that was somehow much worse. Because recognition meant he was starting to ask the right questions, and the right questions led to answers that would unravel everything. Katie's jaw tightened, barely perceptible, the kind of micro-movement that only happened when you were trained to hide everything else. She didn't look at him. She was already documenting the procedure in her notes, her handwriting precise and clinical, the kind of documentation that would create exactly the kind of audit trail that had brought her to Cedar Creek Medical in the first place. Pierce stood in the doorway for 7 more seconds. Then he turned and walked back down the corridor, his footsteps echoing against the tile in a rhythm that sounded almost like a countdown. Morrison was still staring at Katie. "Did you really learn that in nursing school?" "No," she said. She was already setting up the drainage collection, arranging supplies with the systematic precision of someone who'd done this in a tent made of canvas and prayers. "You learn that when you have to. When there's no one else." What she didn't say, what her hands were already reaching for, pressing against the faded unit patch sewn deep inside her jacket lining in the break room locker 3 floors away, was that Dr. Pierce had just seen something he wasn't supposed to see. That the calm competence she'd shown under pressure wasn't the kind of skill you picked up on a nursing unit. That the way she'd moved, the terminology that had slipped out without thinking, the absolute absence of hesitation in the face of what would have been a patient death, all of it added up to a question that was much more dangerous than billing fraud. And she had no idea what he was going to do with that information. Dr. Pierce didn't raise his voice when he made the first call. His office door closed with a soft click at 2:13 p.m., exactly 47 minutes after Katie had performed the needle decompression. She was still on the unit, still charting, still moving through the motions of a nurse who had just saved a life. The call to human resources lasted 6 minutes. "Scope of practice violation," he said into the receiver, his tone smooth as silk over broken glass. "She performed a procedure reserved for physicians. I have 3 witnesses. I want it documented before end of shift." The second call came at 2:34 p.m. The hospital administrator owed him a favor, a consulting contract, a research fund, something from years back that had never been publicly discussed. "We need her gone today," Pierce said. "Medical error fabrication won't stick, but overstepping her license will. Make it clean." The third call, placed at 3:01 p.m. to the security office, was the shortest. "Revoke her building access immediately. She's to be escorted from the premises at the end of her shift. No access to records. No documentation retrieval. Nothing." The man on the other end of that line didn't ask questions. Katie felt it coming before anyone said a word. The shift supervisor appeared at 4:22 p.m. with the hospital administrator trailing behind her like a shadow with a clipboard. The administrator's name was Caldwell, and his face had the careful blankness of a man executing someone else's order. "Captain," the supervisor began, then caught herself. "Ms. Rodriguez. We need to speak with you in the office." Katie set down her pen. The chart she'd been updating, the general's vitals, his oxygen saturation climbing steadily, his color improving, would have to wait. She followed them down the corridor, past the break room where 3 nurses suddenly became very interested in their phones, past the medication station where a resident found something urgent to check in the computer. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in flat, institutional white. The office smelled like recycled air and someone's cold coffee from yesterday. Caldwell sat behind his desk. The supervisor stood by the door like a guard. Your employment with Cedar Creek Medical is terminated, effective immediately, Caldwell said, reading from a prepared statement like he was reciting a legal document. Dr. Pierce has documented a clear pattern of practicing beyond your scope of license. The needle decompression you performed without physician authorization constitutes a serious violation of hospital policy and state nursing regulations. Katie's hands remained steady. Her voice, when she spoke, came out level and measured. The resident froze. General Holloway's lung collapsed. Noted, Caldwell said, not looking up. However, your actions have created significant liability. This facility cannot retain you. It wasn't a conversation. It was an execution reading its own indictment. Katie nodded once and stood. I'll gather my things. Security will escort you, the supervisor said quietly. Hospital policy for immediate terminations. The walk to her locker took 3 minutes. Security, a man named Foster whom she'd nodded to most mornings, positioned himself at a respectful distance. Her locker held 5 weeks of accumulated things, an extra pair of compression socks, a half-empty container of antacids, the small blue notebook where she'd been documenting patterns in the surgery center's billing codes. The notebook she left. It would mean nothing to anyone else, and taking it would only signal that she'd been onto something. But her jacket hung on the hook, and inside the lining, stitched with military precision into a hidden pocket, was the faded unit patch from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. The emblem of the men she'd trained. The men who'd come home. The men who hadn't. She lifted the jacket carefully and felt the weight of it, not physical weight, but the kind that lives in memory. The cracked Quantico mug sat on the shelf below. 10 years old, dulled from 1,000 washings, the handle held together with careful tape. And the photograph, wallet-sized, of her fire team from Tikrit. 22 years old in the image, all of them were. For faces, young and sharp and alive. 3 of them had stones on their graves now. Katie placed the mug in the cardboard box Foster had provided. The photograph followed. The dying succulent from the break room windowsill, the one everyone forgot to water, went in last. She didn't know why. The plant was already brown, already failing. But it had been alive once, and that felt important to remember. The rain started as she left through the employee entrance. Not gentle rain, but the kind that fell in sheets, that soaked through hospital scrubs in seconds and turned the parking lot into a maze of reflected light and shadow. Katie walked to the nearest bus stop, the cardboard box balanced against her hip, the rain streaming down her face and neck. A bus bench sat under a shelter that leaked at the corners. She sat down at 5:06 p.m. and waited. The box felt heavier now. Inside it, she carried everything that remained of her identity, the cracked vessel from an academy that had trained her to lead, the dying plant that no one had tended, the photograph of ghosts. Her phone had 3 missed calls from a Pentagon number she couldn't reach. The mission was over. Not completed. Over. She'd been placed at Cedar Creek Medical to document the billing fraud, to build a case that would stand up in court, to protect the military patients who came through those doors. 18 days in, she had saved a man's life. And in doing so, she'd burned the entire operation to ash. No documentation. No evidence gathered. No case file ready for prosecution. Just a fired nurse sitting in the rain with a box of broken things. The rain fell harder. Katie opened the box and looked at the photograph. The 3 faces of men who had trusted her training, who had gone forward into the dark, who had not come home. She held the image so long the water began to spot the paper. For a moment, just one moment, her hand moved toward the drainage grate at the edge of the bus stop. The box would fit. The evidence of her life, her mission, her entire identity reduced to a cardboard container sinking into the city system. She could let it go. She could be nobody. She could walk away from this place and never look back. Never think about the general in room for 47 who'd called her something, a name that wasn't hers, a rank she couldn't claim, a call sign that belonged to a life she'd supposed was in the past. Her hand shook. Not from fear. From the kind of trembling that comes from absolute restraint, from holding something back that wanted desperately to break free. She pulled the photograph back inside the box. The patch was still there, stitched into the jacket lining. That patch had been sewn by her own hands at 2 a.m. in a barracks in Fallujah, a permanent record of a unit that no longer existed as she'd known it. The patch had moved from uniform to uniform, from life to life, never displayed, never acknowledged. Just waiting. Always waiting. Rain drummed against the shelter. The bus stop was empty except for Katie and the weight of 5 weeks' accumulated secrecy. Then, distant, almost inaudible over the rain, she heard it. The distinctive rhythm of rotor blades cutting through wet air. Not a medical helicopter from Denver. Something bigger. Something military grade. The sound grew closer, and Katie's head lifted. Headlights appeared in the street beyond the bus stop's shelter, moving deliberately, not with the casual purpose of city traffic but with the intentionality of something with a destination and authorization to reach it. The headlights resolved into a convoy of 3 black government sedans. They pulled to the curb with the precision of something that had done this before. Katie stood under the bus shelter's metal awning, rain drumming against it in a rhythm like distant mortar fire, and watched the doors open. 2 agents in dark suits emerged first, FBI credentials already in hand. Then came a Marine in dress blues, colonel's eagles on his shoulders, face carved from something harder than bone. Behind him, a 2-star general in service dress alphas, ribbon stacked across his chest like a history of wars most people would never understand. They moved toward her in formation, not threatening, but deliberate. A retrieval. The rain didn't touch them, they walked through it like it had been ordered to stand aside. The colonel reached her first. His eyes found hers and held. Captain Rodriguez. She didn't flinch. Didn't confirm. Just waited. We need you to come with us. Now. Back at Cedar Creek Medical, the emergency had already begun. General Holloway's monitors had started alarming at 11:41 p.m., his post-op recovery taking a catastrophic turn. A second pulmonary embolism, sudden and massive. The on-call resident called a rapid response, but his hands shook as he read the EKG printout. The attending wasn't answering his page. By 11:51, the general was going into septic shock. The ER staff stood frozen, watching his O2 saturation plummet. 92, 87. 79, the ventilator pushed air into useless tissue. Someone whispered for a second surgeon. Someone else started making calls. That's when the doors burst open. Katie walked in ahead of the Marine colonel, still wearing the rain on her scrubs. The agent stayed at the threshold. FBI doesn't work inside hospital bays without invitation. But Katie did. She moved past the attending like he was furniture, reached the general's bedside, and without speaking, without asking permission, began assessing. Blood pressure 68/40. Pulse ready and rapid. Core temperature dropping. Her hands moved with the terrible efficiency of someone who had done this in a forward operating base with nothing but field supplies and the knowledge that for minutes was all you got before the brain started dying. Get me a 7.5 endotracheal tube, she said to the resident. And 100 units of heparin for push. Now. The resident didn't move. He looked at the attending. The attending looked at Katie like she'd materialized from a fever dream. You just fired me, Katie said. Her voice had changed. The timid nurse was gone. What remained had the weight of command. But his crashing. So either step aside or help. The colonel watched from the doorway, silent. The FBI agents took notes. Dr. Pierce appeared at the far end of the corridor at exactly 11:53, moving fast. He'd been called. Hospital protocol. When a post-op crash happens at midnight, the surgeon gets called. He pushed into the trauma bay and stopped dead. Katie had the tube placed, the medication line running, and the general's O2 saturation climbing back toward viability. 82, 87. 91, she was checking the central line for clotting, her focus absolute, her movements economical. She didn't acknowledge Pierce's presence. Didn't need to. Pierce's face cycled through three colors: shock, rage, then a calculating panic that meant he was about to do something catastrophic. He stepped forward like he owned the room. That nurse has no authority here. Security, remove. Stand down, doctor. The colonel's voice came quiet, but it carried the weight of 20 years of command. That is Captain Rodriguez. And she outranks everyone in this building. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical breath. The resident's eyes widened. The attending took a step backward. Dr. Pierce's jaw worked soundlessly. Katie finished her assessment without looking up. The general's saturation held at 94. His pressure was climbing. The crisis had turned. She stepped back from the bed with the same controlled precision that had brought her this far, and for the first time, she looked directly at Pierce. "He'll live," she said. "Unlike some people, I don't let personal grievances affect patient care." That's when Pierce broke. Actually broke. The facade of authority shattered like dropped glass, and what emerged was pure desperation. He lunged toward the general's chart, claiming he'd documented everything wrong, that Katie had falsified records, that she was a fraud, his voice rising, cracking, accusations tumbling out in a desperate rush to control the narrative before it controlled him. An FBI agent stepped smoothly into his path. Pierce grabbed her arm. That was the moment his career ended. Not the fraud. Not the billing scheme. Not even the public humiliation. It was the moment he put his hands on a federal agent in front of witnesses while trying to obstruct an investigation. They had him in handcuffs by 12:06. His rights read as he was escorted from the trauma bay, past the silent stares of every nurse on the floor. Some of them had eaten lunch with him. Some had trusted him. All of them watched him walk out in cuffs, his career ending in real time. The next 24 hours moved with the velocity of institutional machinery finally aimed at a target. The background check that had flagged Katie's security clearance triggered an emergency review. Cedar Creek's legal team, panicked, ran the numbers. They found everything: the inflated charges, the kickbacks, the billing schemes that had netted Pierce somewhere close to $2.4 million over 7 years. The FBI arrived with subpoenas at 6:33 a.m. By noon, the story was moving across every major outlet. Surgeon's fraud scheme exposed. Hospital faces federal investigation. The narrative had legs. News vans parked in the Cedar Creek parking lot. Administrators issued statements. The hospital board met in emergency session. But what ended Pierce's career wasn't the charges. It wasn't even the front-page exposure. It was what happened when his medical school mentor, a man Pierce hadn't spoken to in 23 years, was watching the morning news with his wife and saw the clip. 60 seconds of video, edited to perfection by some viral media account. Dr. Pierce in the break room, verbally degrading Katie in front of the Gold Star family. His voice contemptuous. His body language dismissive. His words clinical and cruel in a way that had somehow slipped past his filter because he'd believed, absolutely, that she was just a nurse and nobody important would ever see it. His mentor made one phone call to the state medical board. Just one. By 4:17 p.m. that same day, the board had issued its preliminary finding. Gross moral turpitude. Conduct unbecoming a physician. Immediate suspension pending formal revocation proceedings. The finding would be finalized by end of business Friday. Pierce's career didn't end. It was severed. 6 months later, Katie walked past the community college on Wasatch Avenue during a routine supply run for the general's new trauma wing. The CPR course was being taught in the basement classroom. Through the small window, she could see him, Dr. Stephen Pierce, according to the name tag visible on his polo shirt, standing in front of a mannequin, demonstrating chest compressions to a class of 5 board high school students. His movements were mechanical. His voice had lost its edge. When one of the students called him doctor, he flinched. She didn't slow down. Didn't need to. The universe had already delivered its verdict. The helicopter was waiting on the flight line at Peterson Air Force Base, rotors already turning. She knew this model, UH-60M Black Hawk, painted in the matte gray of active operations, the kind of bird that didn't carry passengers to tourism destinations. The general stood beside it, no longer in recovery clothes but in dress blues, decoration after decoration across his chest. When he saw her approaching in her Marine Service dress uniform for the first time since Cedar Creek, he rendered a salute. She returned it. Captain to Marine General. Formal and absolute. Inside her jacket, sewn into the lining where it had been hidden for 4 weeks, was the faded unit patch from Tikrit. The names of her fallen. But now, for the first time since her deployment ended, she was authorized to wear them openly. The patch was stitched onto the shoulder of her uniform jacket now, visible to anyone who cared to look. No more hiding. No more cover identity. No more pretending to be less than she was. "Welcome to Task Force Nightingale," the general said as she climbed into the helicopter bay. "Chief of Combat Medical Operations. You requested this posting." "I did," Katie said. The rotors accelerated. The bay door sealed. As the Black Hawk lifted off the tarmac, she could see Cedar Creek Medical shrinking below her, the building where she'd saved a life while dying inside, where she'd held her composure while being systematically dismantled, where she'd learned the most important lesson of her military career, that sometimes being underestimated is the sharpest weapon you possess. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint finally being released. The general handed her a classified briefing folder stamped with fresh operational parameters. 3 tours in 18 months, pending security review. Mali, Philippines, and if the situation holds, Syria. Katie opened the folder and began reading. The work ahead was immense. Lives to save in places where the infrastructure barely existed, medics to train, soldiers to patch back together. She'd have done it for nothing. But the Marine Corps was paying her $127,000 a year to do exactly what she was built for, and no one would ever mistake her for just a nurse again. She didn't smile. But she did allow herself one small, measured breath. The helicopter banked toward the horizon, and Katie Rodriguez, Captain, Marine Corps, Nightingale 6, disappeared into the operational darkness where she had always belonged. If you're still watching, hit that like button. And I want to know, would you have saved the man who fired you, or walked away? Drop your answer in the comments. Subscribe and let's see how this ends.